During the last 50 years, one can say that art history and other disciplines have achieved great results concerning to clarify and to map women's possibilities of becoming artists and to practice in this profession. However, these studies have mainly focused on women painters, women sculptors, and women artists in the decorative arts. Have not received the same focus. But this has changed the last 10-15 years, where many important studies have been published and known about women sculptors, both in the Nordic countries and elsewhere. And these studies show that a striking number of these women trained, to become sculptors at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, not least from the Nordic countries. Like their painting sisters, they traveled to the continent to continue their studies, especially to Paris. And there they got to know a new and freer art form and style, and they had opportunities to study and to practice their profession in a way that would not have been possible at home. And several of these women sculptors remained in Paris or abroad for many years. The increased presence of women in the artistic life in the end of the 19th century marks, of course, an important shift and reflects discussions about gender at this period. This was, as we all know, a pioneering time for women's right to have a professional career and a paid employment. Art was an attractive choice for the daughters of the middle classes. And in 1864, in Sweden, Sweden became one of the first countries in Europe to open a section for women at the Academy of Fine Arts. And most of these women who studied there had before that been students at the technical school, which had opened its doors to women in 1856. And the technical school was a school mainly for training to become a teacher of handicrafts, and its majority of students were women. But at the same time, there were limits to a career as an independent artist, and conventional opinions had powerful influence on what was suitable to be an occupation and a profession for a woman. Sculpture was, since an old tradition, a masculine profession and occupation. It was heavy, dirty, and not according to the conventions of what was suitable for a woman. So when women entered this field, they had to confront many obstacles. Many of them navigated the art scene with great talent and success, and they encountered a new art market, often abroad, as I mentioned, and they lived also unconventional life, often unmarried and sometimes in same-sex relationships, far from home. And a majority, if not all of them, were engaged in questions concerning women artists' rights. And in spite of this, almost all of them were forgotten in the 20th century. Hardly anyone without the art historical circle can mention a woman sculptor from the Nordic countries. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about our project, which is a work in progress, of course, and we start to see some result, and it's going to be, as was mentioned, an exhibition next year in Stockholm and also a publication. But my interest in this field really started when we did a Rodin exhibition some years ago, where we of course had to mention Camille Claudel, who is perhaps the most known female sculptor that there has ever been. But it was not always like that, as I think you all know. She was forgotten more or less until the 1950s and really rediscovered again in the 1980s. But when we did this exhibition, we could include some works from Camille Claudel, and also thanks to new research, because this was a collaboration with Atheneum Art Museum, and with new discoveries, and also by the researcher Lisa Lindgren, we had the possibility to exhibit works from by Sigrid af Forselles, who we could also see on a slide here before, and she had done research on Sigrid af Forselles and Hilda Flodin, two Finnish pupils to Rodin. When we did this exhibition, we noticed that the audience were almost more interested by these women and Camille Claudel and these women students than Rodin himself. So this led to the idea to start to develop this to a proper project. And also one important point of departure, which made it all possible, is this publication, which was made just in 2012 by this wonderful researcher Irja Bergström, whose book, which was published in Swedish, is really a pioneer study on Swedish women sculptors, where she mapped 20 sculptors from this period. So this was really the starting point. But also in the Nordic countries, of course, I mentioned Lisa Lindgren's groundbreaking studies from 2009, and also, of course, Jorunn Weiteberg from Norway, whose book on Ambrosia Tønnesen was really a discovery. And in Denmark, Emilie Boe Birlich has recently made her thesis on Anne-Marie Carl Nielsen, and I want to mention also Vibeke Røstorp, who is based in France, who has mapped the Nordic circle among many there, among which many are women. Eva-Lena Karlsson, also a colleague of mine at the Nationalmuseum, who early on also highlighted Agnes de Frumry, a Swedish sculptor. Anne Rivière, French art historian, who has worked and published extensively on Camille Claudel, but on women sculptors in general, and she published in 2018, I think, the Dictionnaire des sculptrices en France, but many other publications as well. And Marianne Sterks, who from Belgium, who has published, for example, The Invisible Sculptors, sculptures by women in the 19th century urban public space in 2008. And also there have been exhibitions, Sculpturelle, in immense success in 2009 in Musée des Années 30 in Paris, but also in Bremen last year, an exhibition on Bildhauerinnen, German sculptors, and also in the Slovak National Gallery. There was an exhibition in 2015 and a publication about women sculptors in former Czechoslovakia who mapped the existence and fate of female sculptors who underwent classical sculpting training. And not the least, in 2017, Camille Claudel had her own museum in Nogent-sur-Seine outside Paris. So you see, this is something which is really going on for the moment. So we're happy and really encouraged to continue this and start this project, which is a Nordic collaboration, I should mention, of course, with Nationalmuseum in Oslo and Atheneum in Finland. The aim of the project is thus to collect knowledge about Nordic women sculptors who were active during the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the project aims at investigating and problematizing what it meant to be a women sculptor at this period. We want to map Nordic women sculptors, both those known and those less known, and to study them both in a national and a Nordic context and in an international context, from a historical and art historical perspective, and also a social historical and context of women's rights and the women's rights movements. And the main questions are that we think it's possible to talk a phenomenon of women sculptors. What do these women sculptors have in common within the profession, and in the profession this profession linked to gender issues? And what similarities and differences are there among the Nordic countries? How did they manage as women sculptors, and which obstacle did they encounter in terms of education, exhibition, commissions, and acquisitions? And are there specific characteristics of a female element in their sculpting? And also one should talk a little bit about the delimitation of the study. Why is it necessary to talk about and to separate women from men? I mean, there are also forgotten male artists, and that is also a very interesting topic. But we do feel that this is really a phenomenon. There were this group of women sculptors, especially from the Nordic countries, is worth to study in its own, separately from the men, to highlight even further this topic. They were, as I mentioned, very numerous and famous and appreciated during their lifetime, yet almost forgotten in the 20th century. And also this question about being a sculptor linked to gender is very interesting. Also the social context. Perhaps I should say something about the pictures I just put here. You see Camille Claudel to the left and Ambrosia Tønnesen in the middle, and Harriet Hosmer, the American sculptor, known as the first American neoclassical sculptor who entangled monumental sculpting. So the social context, what was the background of the Nordic sculptors? From which social class did they emanate? And that we can already say that they come from an upper middle class, which permitted them to start their studies in the art schools. Where did they pursue their artistic training? Which were their networks, and how did they use these? How involved were they in women's issues in general? And how much did their lifestyle and personal choices affect their professional lives? We see here Carolina Benedix Bruce, who was one of the first women sculptors in Paris, where she arrived in the 1880s, 1885. She studied before Falguière. They did not study for Rodin, for example. There were more these academic French sculptors who served also as art teachers in the private art schools. So Carolina Benedix Bruce, she studied before Falguière, and she settled in Grès, where she met the painter, the Canadian painter William Blair Bruce. And they married, and this is his depiction of her. And I think it's very interesting that this painting is entitled Femme Sculpteur. It's really her in her profession. And also the production. What are the characteristics of their production? How were they received by their contemporaries and by the press, by the art critics? Were there certain types of subjects, materials, objects, categories that were considered more or less suitable for women? And yes, it was. We can say that because they were specifically encouraged when it comes to themes of children, women and children, for example, depicting feelings, also genre sculptures. We see, for example, Agnes de Frumeney, the Swedish sculptor who arrived in Paris in the 1890s, and she stayed there for 30 years, and she specialized in these small figurines, among other things that you can see here. And they are very close to Camille Claudel's sculptures, if you are familiar with them, and there were a sort of rivalry between them, and we know that Camille Claudel accused the Swedish woman for copying her. So this was a new art market where these women were clever enough to find their way. And whereas Carolina Benedict's Bruce, for example, this little statuette that you can see here was exhibited in the Stockholm exhibition in 1897, and it was criticized because it was being vulgar and too naturalistic, because they were influenced in Paris by the new naturalism, but this was really not comprehended at home. Alice Nordin, another, perhaps the most famous of the Swedish sculptors, who specialized in the design and art crafts and made many lamps and was a superstar in designing lamps. So much a superstar that now one wants to attribute all lamps like this to Alice Nordin, but it's not the case. And also what were bought by the museums and what were not, and why in that case. And how come that they have been forgotten for such a long time? So it's questions concerning education, professionalization, institutionalization, production, linked to social history, social network, political and gender studies, and also art history, of course. Just quickly, some words about our process now. We started with a study day in 2019, where we wanted to map the research that was going on in this field. It was a Nordic collaboration. Joran Weiterberg, for example, Lisa Lindgren, the researchers that I have mentioned were all there. So instead of doing this at the end of the project, we wanted to start with this. And also, what do we have in the collections? Well, we do have some sculptures, but not that many, because that is already a result that you can see that these sculptors were not bought very often from the museums, to the public and national museums. We have one example here, Sigrid Blomberg, the sculpture to the left. It was the first work by a woman sculptor that was brought to the National Museum. It was bought in 1900. It was very much appreciated at the time, and it is said in the art papers that people came deliberately to the National Museum just to see this sculpture. She was specialized in religious sculpture. And yet it has not been shown for all 20th century. So we are very happy now that with the reopening of the National Museum, it is put on display again. Ruth Milles and Alice Nordin are some other examples that we have in the collections. I have counted about 15 women sculptors active in the 1880s to 1930, who we can find in National Museum and the Modern Museum, because from the beginning it was one museum. But that is also, they were many more, as we can see. So we had to reach out more to the private spheres, because we think that these are sculptures that were collected in homes and still are there. So we have made some crowdsourcing in social media, which has been very successful, actually. I received 40, 50 answers already, and we did this just 3 months ago, after Christmas. And at least half of the answers, I say, are really bringing new knowledge, often relatives or someone who knew someone who, a woman sculptor. Very much appreciated, and also the press picked this up, and that is really when the traditional press, when we started to get even more letters and such. So we hope that it can also bring some new sculptures to show, and it already has. One example of answers that we had was a person who had an old relative, who was actually familiar to Ida Eriksson Mollard, who there are no works left from her. And she was the first woman sculptor from Sweden who had a scholarship to go to Paris, and she had held a salon with her husband William Moulard at 6 Rue Vercingétorix, which was also the address of Gauguin. And this salon, as you might know, was very frequented by Nordic artists and French culture people also. But after her husband's death in the 1930s, the sculptures are supposed to be, well, there's nothing left. And so this relative, it was very interesting to say that she at home had some pictures of Ida Eriksson, no artworks, unfortunately enough, but for example, this notification of the death of Ida Moulard and some letters also. So, and also it continues to live its own life. Someone has started a Facebook group, Help Nationalmuseum, to collect women's sculptures. It's perfect. This is social media. It lives its own lives, and we can't control it, and we are not supposed to, because it really it can be a very valuable information found in this way. But also traditional media and traditional publications like this peer-reviewed women biographical lexica, which is very important also, and that we hope to contribute to in the future. We also do some collecting deliberately with the acquisitions. These are examples of acquisitions that have been done the last 4 years of works by women sculptors. So I think it was interesting that the speaker before me talked about the number of percentage of women artists in the collections today. Was that today? 3, 5? Yes, and 4%. And that is also the number that was when it was counted in the 1990s, how many women artists there were in Nationalmuseum. They reached the number also of 3.5%. But only 1% was exhibited then. But now we have about 15% of women artists permanently in the collections on display. But it's not good enough, because we know that at this time 1/3 of the students at the Art Academy were women, and 40% of active artists who lived by their profession after their education were women. Yes, an important acquisition of Agnes de Frumery some years ago, and just to show the influence by Rodin at the time, and she called Rodin the new Michelangelo, and she was really influenced by that. So yes, we do now deliberately put women in the permanent exhibitions, and I mentioned the number, yes, of about 15%. But then it's also modern design in our collection with more women. We plan exhibitions, and we have had exhibitions also of women pioneers, women designers between the wars and the last years. And yes, I think perhaps my time is out, so I would just some quick words about the results so far. Well, this list of names, it keep on growing with more and more names that we hope to map then the women sculptors who were trained professionally. That is, the delimitation is also that they were trained professionally or exhibited professionally or were bought at the museum and public institutions and exhibited in a public space. And some features then, that even though they worked in the style more like a juste milieu, they were very experimental in their way of finding exhibition arenas, art markets, and they were often pioneers in the decorative arts in exploring new genres, new techniques, new markets. And so in that case, they were really sharp, and they were self-sufficient. They leave home, main career abroad, for all their life almost, and they live a non-conventional life, often in relation with other women, engaged in women's rights. And they were, sorry for the misspelling, they're strong, it's supposed to be strong. Swedish Nordic group were many, an over-representation seen to the country's size, and that is something that we still would like to answer, why is that the case? And yes, this is just an example to say that once they did monuments, or they were often criticized because they were appreciated for the feminine side, but when they were not, when they were trying to do something else, they were not feminine enough, and only a man could do this kind of work. It was said in the critique when Sigrid Friedman, for example, did this Centaur. Yes, and also then that there are not so much of them in the public museums, but often their legacy is to be found in the private spheres or in the local regional museums. Yes, I will stop there. Thank you.